Okay, so in the last video, we talked about the generic database service, and we went through and we built this class called database service, which for the most part lets you do two things, command and query. And the generic part comes on either the command or the query. But here's a small change that we're going to encounter in real life. Most DB contexts don't look like this, so I thought maybe we can make this a little more realistic. Usually a database context looks a little bit more like this. It takes a DbContextOptions here, and it's usually of type whatever your DbContext is. So this is usually what it looks like, okay? And then usually, or at least in my cases, I usually don't handle it here. I usually pass it on down to the parent class, which is our just this DbContext class here. So you can do that by calling base, and you just pass that parameter right down through. Easy enough. Okay, so how does this change the rest of our life? Well, if you remember, we are creating this DbContext through a database factory. So let's just see if that still builds. And it seems to be happy. And oh, okay, there we go. There's the error right there. So it doesn't take a string anymore, right? It takes DbContextOptions. So let's see what that looks like. Let's assume that for the sake of time, we are going to inject the DbContextOptions through the container. So usually you'll see something like configuration dot use SQL Server dot build or something like that. Let's just assume that's in the container. So let's grab it out. So DbContextOptions right here, and it's of the type that we want, which would be my DbContext options. Okay, there we go. And then we can do the similar, just pull it in. So instead of passing the config like we were before, we are now just going to throw this options guy right down into our constructor. Okay, this looks great, right? And oh, keep in mind the beauty of factories, right? Because we never had to touch our database service class. All we had to do was change the factory, which is kind of cool. So I hope you guys recognize that. So now if we look at our database context factory, it's happy enough. We're passing in options of DbContextOptions, and we're able to use this. If we look at the database service class, we're able to go ahead and use this right here, and everyone's still happy. C# isn't complaining. But the problem here is that we're completely dependent on this one context. What happens if we want another context? Well, okay, I guess we would create another database context factory, which in turn we would have to create another database service class, and it just doesn't feel quite right. That's a lot of redundant code that we really don't want to deal with. So how can we make this more generic? Well, let's go ahead and just change my DbContext to our capital T, which is our generic, and then you can define generics at a class level. Last time we did it at a method level. You can do it at a class level by this syntax here, less than T greater than, and that just tells C#, hey, it's a generic. But we're still getting an issue here, so let's look at the hover tip. And so it says that type T cannot be used as a parameter tContext because there is no conversion from T to DbContext. What this is saying is, if you look at the hover text of DbContextOptions, and the first line, it says the DbContextOptions of generic type tContext, so they use tContext there instead of T, just more readable, that's fine. And then there is a constraint, and this is the important part. So the constraint is where tContext is a DbContext. So you can think of it as like a parent class. So it's saying there has to be a way to get from tContext to DbContext. All right, so how do we do that? Well, actually, we're just going to do the same thing that they did. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing here. tContext, I'm going to change the T just to make it more readable so that everyone knows, hey, this in fact is a tContext. And then now we're going to add our generic constraint where tContext is of type DbContext. So now we're saying, you know what, when it gets to this level, I guarantee you that this class, this generic class tContext, will in fact be a DbContext. So now everyone's happy again, except for this little guy right here. So now it's saying, all right, I know you're a DbContext, but how do I create you? Because you can add a new constraint here, so you can you can try to do like new here, and that might make it happy, but it doesn't really know, and it doesn't really know how to create this tContext, this generic DbContext that lives out there somewhere. C# is complaining about it. And even on top of that, if there's multiple constructors, you know how it's going to figure that out. And so anyways, let's get to it, and I will show you how I do it. I use reflection, so if you're not familiar, you may want to take a minute to look it up. But reflection is the ability to use the meta of the type system to create what you're looking for. So it's not going to be quite. Let's just dive into it and see if it makes sense. So the create method is going to change like this. So we are going to get a type of tContext, and this is what I'm talking about. We're diving into type land here. We're diving into the meta. So now we're dealing with a type. All right, type of tContext, and then when we dive into reflection, we can have this method called getConstructor. So we're saying get me the class of whatever type this is. We know it's a DbContext, but it's going to be something more than that, right? It's probably going to be my DbContext. Now get me that constructor of that class. And you can say that since there's multiple constructors, you can pass an array of types, and the array is going to be the parameters that go into that constructor. So it's able to go out and find the exact one that you want to use, even if there's multiples. So let's do a new type array. And we're going to say type of DB. So we want the constructor that only takes the DBContext options. That's it. So I'm going to say DBContext options of type tContext. So this is pretty constrained. It should be able to figure that out. All right, great. So now we're saying, okay, get me the constructor of this class where it has one parameter, because I only have one thing in the array, one parameter of type DBContext of this context. That seems like it'll work. Okay, so then the way that once you get the constructor, which keep in mind a constructor is just like a method. So once you get a method, you can actually call that method. So usually, you would say method, and then you would call it with the parameters, right? Param P1, P2, whatever. But when you're in metaland, you have to invoke the method. So we're going to do it like that. And obviously, it does take parameters, because we just said, give me the constructor with parameters. So now we have to pass those parameters. So we're going to make an object array, because that's what the invoke method wants. So you should be passing a parameter. Every parameter that you specify in the get constructor, you should also specify a value for those parameters. So you can kind of think of it as keys and values if you want. Let's take a look here. So now we want to pass an object array, and really we just want that one. So it should just be my options. Okay, so if you let that soak in for a minute, we're finding the type of tContext, grabbing the constructor where it has one parameter of this type, and then we're passing our actual parameter in when invoking that method, the constructor method. All right, so there's one more problem here. Let's see what the complaint is. It says cannot implicitly convert type object to tContext. An explicit conversion exists. So it says when you call the invoke method, since we're in metaland, it can't figure out exactly what it is that you're returning. So it says, you know what, I'm just going to return some object. That's all I can tell you. I'm returning some object. So invoke says I'm returning an object, but the create method says no, I'm returning a tContext. And so essentially they're butting heads. What we can do here is we know that this is going to return a tContext, so we're just going to cast it right here. And that should make everyone happy. So now we have a really generic database context factory. Very cool. We have to change one thing. Database service is going to be upset now because it says, you told me I was going to get a DbContext factory where in fact this doesn't exist. Like this class no longer exists because now it's generic. So what's the generic that you want me to use? Well, we can say my DbContext. We could do that. We could just say my DbContext here. But now we're still running into that same issue where every time we create a new context, we have to create a new database service, right? So we would kind of prefer this guy to be a tContext as well. So let's see what that looks like. tContext. So this should feel pretty familiar. Let's just go ahead and add it to the class. So we tell C# this is our generic. And then Now we also have to add it to the interface. There we go. And this guy now is complaining because it wants tContext instead of my DbContext. All right, that's starting to look a little bit better. Now let's do one more thing and see why this is complaining. tContext cannot be used as a type parameter. Okay, so this is the error that we were getting before. The DbContext factory is constraining, remember this line here? It's constraining our tContext down to a DbContext. But if we go up a level, we haven't added that constraint here yet. So in fact, tContext could be anything. Could be, I don't know, like a string. So it's saying, hey, you can't pass me anything. You can only pass me a DbContext. So I need you to guarantee me that it's only going to be a DbContext. So let's go ahead and do that. Where tContext is in fact a DbContext. And does it like that? Do I have to put it after the... Yeah, I think I do. Let's try that. That's better. And then I think I might as well add that to the interface also, so that anyone that's using the interface would also know that this is a requirement. So this looks pretty good. The only thing I think that's left here is that we have to update our registration. But let me just take a glance here. So essentially we can ask for any DbContext that we want. So yeah, let's update the registration and then we'll see how it looks in the controller. So we have to actually change this a little bit. The way that we have to change it is this way. So that's how you do registrations of generic types in ASP.NET Core, in case you were wondering. You have to pull it out of the type constraints or the type parameters and put it in as actual parameters, because you can do type of these empty generics and that's acceptable. And then I think we can do the same thing here for factory. Let's take a look. Okay, we can. It's going to let us. Good. I was a little concerned there. All right, so we've got the registrations done. How does this look in Home Controller? So we used to ask for an iDatabase That's not possible anymore. We need to ask for something a little more generic. So what is our generic here? Well, Home Controller right now only wants, even though we have multiple DbContext potentially registered, it only wants the one. It only wants my DbContext. So this is the point where we can actually flip the switch and say, all right, this is the exact one that we want. So let's go ahead and add that down here as well. And you'll see that there's really not that much code that changes. So I hope this was useful to you guys, and let me know if you have any other optimizations that you do on a daily basis, that is. And thanks for watching.